Hey guys, Jin here, and this is a Ball Lightning build for Season 3 of Diablo IV. I know this build's fallen from the heights of Season 2, but it's still strong enough to take down the usual Tier 100 dungeons, Malphas, Duriel, and Lilith. Please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, as it helps out a lot. Without further ado, let's get to the build. So starting with the skill tree, we're going to be taking 2 into Firebolt, then we're going to take 1 into Potent Warding, 1 into Devastation, and 3 into Elemental Dominance. Then in the defensive skills, we're taking 1 into Flame Shield. Then we're going to be putting 5 into Teleport, and we're going to take Shimmering Teleport. We're going to get 1 into Elemental Attunement, and 3 into Glass Cannon. And also 1 into Ice Armor, and Mystical Ice Armor. Then we come down here to our Conjuration skills. We're going to take 1 into Align the Elements to get 3 in Mana Shield and 3 in Protection. We're also going to be taking 1 in Ice Blades and going for Summoned Ice Blades here. Then we're also going to take 3 into Conjuration Mastery. Down into the Mastery skills, of course, we're going to take 5 into Ball Lightning, and we're going to take Wizard's Ball Lightning. Then we're going to take 1 into Static Discharge, and 3 into Invigorating Conduit. So for the ultimate skills, I'm taking 3 into Fiery Surge here, so killing a burning enemy increases our mana regen by 45% for 3 seconds. So it's basically a permanent 45% mana regeneration boost. Of course, if you don't need that, then you could distribute those points elsewhere. Like into Inner Flames, 1 point, and then maxing out Devouring Blaze for the extra increased critical strike damage against burning enemies. Then we're also taking 1 point into Coursing Currents, 3 into Electrocution, all the points into Unstable Currents, and 1 into Conduction. And as for the key passive, we're going to be going with Esu's Ferocity for the huge attack speed % bonus we get from one of our aspects. So that pretty much wraps it up for these skills. Let's move on to the Paragon board. So from the starting board, we're going to be using Control here. That's going to give us a lot of damage to crowd controlled enemies, and also give us 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled, or 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen, synergizing really well with the raiment there. Next up, we have our second board, which is Burning Instinct, and we're going to put in the Destruction Glyph here for the extra critical strike damage and increased damage that gives us. For our third board, it's the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to be putting in the Elementalist Glyph here. So dealing fire, cold, or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. So that's always going to be at 15% for us, so 15% increased damage. For our fourth board, we're going to be using the Frigid Fate board, and we're going to be getting the Adept Glyph in here, so that's going to give us a huge amount of mastery skill damage. For our fifth board, we're going to be using the Ceaseless Conduit board, and we're going to put in the Exploit Glyph here for the vulnerable damage and the increased damage when we deal damage to a vulnerable enemy. For our sixth board, we're going to be using our Static Surge board, and we're going to be putting in the Flame Feeder Glyph. So that's going to give us 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies, as well as increased damage to burning enemies. And with our Firebolt enchant, all enemies will be burning. For the seventh board, we're going to be using the Searing Heat board, and we're going to put in the Territorial Glyph for the damage to close enemies, and the damage reduction against close enemies. And for our last board, the eighth board, we're going to be using the Elemental Summoner board, and we're going to be putting the Charge Glyph in here. So picking up Crackling Energy will grant us 5% increased damage for 5 seconds, up to 15%. So basically 15% increased damage here as well. So that wraps it up for the Paragon board. If I did go a little fast, don't forget all of this will be in the build planner in the description below. So check that out if you want to copy this Paragon board. So now for the enchantments, we're going to be using Ice Blades enchantment for the first slot. So for every 40 seconds in cooldowns we spend, we spawn an Ice Blades on a random enemy. This synergizes really well with Unstable Currents, as this immediately spawns an Ice Blade, and with Flicker Step you can recharge this very fast to get even more Ice Blades. And you can also use your other abilities here for even more cooldowns for even more Ice Blades. Although you should prioritize these for barriers in the higher tier Nightmare dungeons and vaults. For our second enchantment, we're going to be using the Firebolt enchantment. So direct damage from our skills applies up to an additional 26% burning damage over 8 seconds. So this is why we use the damage to burning in the Paragon boards, and also why we use the damage reduction against burning enemies. So that wraps it up for the enchantments. Now for the Seneschal construct.
Greetings.
So the Seneschal construct is the Season 3 gimmick. It is this little spider fellow here that follows you around, and you give it governing stones and tuning stones that will support you through your journeys. So starting with the first governing stone, we're going to be using the Tempest stone. So that will electrically charge an enemy, causing it to deal damage to itself and additional enemies over 5 seconds. So for Tempest tuning stones, we're going to be using breaking support. So damage from the skill instantly destroys enemy barrier effects. In addition, there's a chance to make enemies vulnerable. Then efficiency support. So when the supporting skill deals damage, we gain crit chance to the same target's hit. And arcing support. This will allow Tempest to hit 5 additional enemies at this rank, which is rank 5. Next up, we have the Flash of Adrenaline for our other governing stone. So this is going to give us a 20% damage increase for 10 seconds in my case. So we're going to use tactical support here to decrease the cooldown of the skill. Then we're going to use duration support to make it last longer. And we're going to use initiative support, so the supported skill will cause the construct to teleport to the target if out of range. So it's pretty straightforward there for the Seneschal construct. Let's move on to the gear. So for the gear, on the left of the screen I'll list the affixes you want from best to worst. So starting with the Helm, we're going to look for total armor, cooldown reduction, max life, and intelligence. If you can't get that, then look for all stats. And for the aspect, we're going to be using Juggernauts here. So we gain a large flat amount of armor, but our evade cooldown is 100% increased. If you're fighting bosses, then you would use the Godslayer's Crown, and if you have a Shaco, then you would use that over both of them. Godslayer's Crown will give you a awesome unique aspect, so that's really good for Duriel rotations, Malphus, and Lilith. Next up we have the chest piece. We're going to be using the Raiment of the Infinite, so that gives us close damage, damage to stunned enemies, ranks into glass cannon, and to intelligence. But more importantly, the unique aspect. After using teleport, close enemies are pulled to us and stunned for 2 to 3 seconds. But the downside is teleport's cooldown is increased by 20%. So if you don't have access to a raiment yet, you would use something with total armor, damage reduction from burning, damage reduction from close, and damage reduction. If you can't get those, then look for damage reduction from distant or max life. And as for the aspect, you'll be using Disobedience. As you can see, you gain 1.1% increased armor for 4 seconds when you do any form of damage, stacking up to 66%. And this will almost always be up to 66% as you deal so many forms of damage with this build. Next up we have the gloves. At the moment I'm using Fists of Fate, but you would want to be looking for something with critical hit chance, attack speed, lucky hit with primary resource, and intelligence. If you can't get those, then look for all stats. And as for the aspect, you would want to use something like Aspect of Control. That will allow you to deal 25 to 35% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies. Next up we have the pants. We're going to be using Tybalt's Will. That gives us a huge amount of damage percent, as well as maximum resource and damage reduction from close enemies. Also, the unique aspect gives us 20 to 40% increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, so synergizes really well with teleport. And when we become unstoppable, we gain 50 of our primary resource. If you don't have access to Tybalt's Will, you would just use a tanky set of leggings, so something with total armor percent, ranks into ball lightning, and all of the other damage reduction stuff you can find. So close, distant, burning, flat damage reduction, or damage reduction while injured. And as for the aspect, you would use ever-living, so that will let you take 20 to 25% less damage from crowd-controlled or vulnerable enemies. Next up we have the boots. We're going to be using Flicker Step here. So attacks reduce evades cooldown by 1.2 seconds. This really helps out a lot and negates the negative impacts of the Juggernaut aspect. And it also gives us all stats, move speed, ultimate skill damage, and damage reduction from close enemies once again. And also this awesome unique aspect, each enemy you evade through reduces your active ultimate cooldown by 2 to 4 seconds, up to 10 seconds per evade. So basically that allows you to keep your ultimate almost always active, if not always active. So if you can't get the Flicker Step, then you could also use Esu's Heirloom. It's not a bad alternative. Or you could use something normal with move speed percent, mana cost reduction, damage reduction while injured, and ranks into teleport. And as for the aspect, you would use something like Ghost Walkers, so while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you'll gain 10 to 25% increased move speed and can move freely through enemies, which is really handy. Next up we have the one-handed weapon. We're going to be preferring a dagger here because that gives us the damage to close enemies. And for the affixes we're going to be looking for intelligence, all stats, mastery skill damage, and damage to close enemies or vulnerable damage. If you can't get that, then look for crit damage. So as for the aspect, we're going to be using the Storm Swell here. So we deal 21 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. Next we have the Focus, our offhand weapon here. So we're going to be looking for something with critical hit chance, cooldown reduction, resource generation, and damage reduction from burning enemies. So if you can't get those, then look for intelligence or all stats. And as for the aspect, we're going to be looking for conceded here, so that's going to give us 15 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. And of course you're going to be looking for the highest item power possible for the weapon and the focus for the high DPS. Next up we have the Amulet. So we're going to be looking for something with total armor percent, mana cost reduction, ranks into mastery skills, and ranks into conjuration mastery. If you can't get those, look for cooldown reduction, move speed, or intelligence percent. And as for the aspect, we're going to be using the Ancient Flame aspect, so while both bonuses from Esu's Ferocity key passive are active, our attack speed will be increased by 75% in my case. So that'll really help with the Ball Lightning, as Ball Lightning's attack rate is increased by our attack speed bonus up to 25%. Next up we have the Rings, so we're going to be using Tarash's Iridescent Loop. That gives us a lot of non-physical damage, lucky hit percent, which is nice, resource generation and cooldown reduction, which are really nice. And also for each type of elemental damage we deal, gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, and dealing any kind of elemental damage refreshes this. So once that's active, it's basically going to be on until you run out of monsters to hit. And with this build we generally have 3 of the 4 elemental damage types active. So for our other ring we're going to be looking for something with crit chance, resource generation, close damage, and vulnerable damage. If you can't get those, look for crit damage and lightning damage. And as for the aspect, this is where we're going to put our gravitational aspect. So Ball Lightning will orbit around us and deal 15 to 25% increased damage. So if you don't have the Tarash's Iridescent Loop yet, then you would just use a duplicate of this ring basically. And for the aspect, you would want to use another damaging aspect, whatever that may be. Or if you have mana issues, then you could use something like Prodigies, which will give you 15 to 25 mana whenever you use a cooldown. So that pretty much wraps it up for the gear. For the gems, we're going to be using the green gems in the weapons, the red gems in the armor, and for the jewelry, we're going to be using a mix of the diamonds, which are the white gems, and the skulls, just depending on what you need. That about wraps up this build. Thanks for watching. If you found it informative, please leave a like and subscribe as it helps out the channel a lot. Don't forget to check out the planner below to see it all in one place if you want to try this out for yourself. Thanks again, hope to see you in the next video. Bye!